Good morning, and welcome to the final week of our course, London, Past, Present, and Future. I'm Jasmine Hagens, Curator of Lectures, Courses, and Concerts here at the MFA. Attached to today's handout is a survey, as it is the last week, and I would like to thank those of you who come to lots of courses who have filled out about 40 surveys on courses thus far. We're finishing a pretty intense year-long survey of audiences that come to courses and lectures. So the feedback today will be aggregated into that data, and we pull out details like what kind of topics and speakers you love, but we also look at very broad swaths of the information. So thank you all so much for giving us your honest feedback. The handouts can be returned to the ushers as you leave the auditorium today, or they can be mailed back to us at the address on the back of the second sheet. And we have two fantastic summer courses on Cape Cod in July and on Shakespeare in late July and August. Check out the speaker lineups on mfa.org, and fall lectures and courses go on sale Thursday, August 25th at 10 a.m. It is now my honor to introduce today's talk, Here and Now, presented by Edward Saywell, Chief of Exhibition Strategy and Gallery Displays. Saywell joined the MFA in 2006 after working for 9 years in the Department of Drawings at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University. His most recent exhibitions at the MFA include Ellsworth Kelly wood sculpture in 2011. In 2012, he co-curated the exhibition Alex Katz's Prints, a retrospective of the artist's work in that medium. He co-curated with our colleague Liz Munsell the Fall 2015 Maud Morgan Prize exhibition celebrating the work of performance artist Marilyn Arsom. In his current role, Saywell oversees the exhibition and gallery strategy for the entire museum. Edward serves as a commissioner for the Boston Arts Commission, which approves and oversees new public art within the city of Boston, and also serves on the Rose Kennedy Greenway Curatorial Advisory Group, which is currently laying out the framework for public art along the Greenway. Please join me very excitedly in welcoming Edward Saywell.
Good morning and the warmest of welcomes. Can everyone hear me okay right at the back? Great. So quick poll. Who has been to London in the last 5 years? And who traveled to London maybe 30 to 40 years ago? Okay, you're a pretty well-traveled bunch. So I have one confession to make as we start this morning, and that is I dearly, dearly love London and have done so since I was a little kid. And I can remember eagerly the days that I would go down to London from Yorkshire on the train, getting off at the train station at King's Cross, like Harry Potter, and having the most wonderful days in the city. And I would eagerly buy books on the history of London and read about the city, and since then, I have always taken enormous pleasure in returning to what is one of the most extraordinary cities in the world. And so over the course of this morning, I'm going to give a pretty unabashedly personal and actually slightly quirky talk about London now. And it's one which I think can be encapsulated by a wonderful little quote by James Boswell, the great 18th century biographer, the biographer, in fact, of Samuel Johnson. And he talked about how, and I quote, "You are struck with London as comprehending the whole of human life in all its variety, the contemplation of which is inexhaustible." And it truly is. I think for all of us, whenever we go to London, it is absolutely extraordinary to think that this is a city that has 17,000 music performances a year. There are 200 theatre shows every night across the city. There are more than 300 languages spoken. It is truly one of the most diverse cities of the world. It has more international visitors, over 16 million, than any other city on the planet. It has 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. It's also one of the most expensive cities to live in. And perhaps curiously, but not so much if you do think about it, although today it actually has the largest population that it has ever had, it's about 8.6 million, it has actually only just reached the level that London had had before World War II. World War II, as we all know, decimated large parts of the city, and well over 2.5 million people escaped the city for the countryside during the bombings. So there is, I think, a sense of genuine wonderment when we think about the city and when we visit the city. And this course is called London Past, Present and Future. And although today we are talking about the present, it is one that is inescapably bound up with the past and also with the future when we think about London and when we encounter it in all of its glories. Now, I want to start out by thanking 2 people who certainly helped me when I traveled to London and when I lived there for 2 years, and I suspect helped all of you in one way or another on your visits to London. The first is this lady, Mrs. Phyllis Purcell, shown on the left in her youth, and on the right about 10, 15 years ago now. Now, in our pre-cell phone days, remember those, we had to rely on the good old paper maps. And in London, I'm sure many of you remember when you explored the city, you used an A to Z, and they are still around. On the left is actually the very first version that was published in 1936, and a more recent version on the right. And we have this lady to thank for it. The legend goes that in 1935, Phyllis got lost in the center of London, and that was because she was using a map that was 17 years old. Now, whether this is apocryphal, a little bit of legend, I suspect there is, the story goes that for 18 hours every day, she would rise at 5 a.m. and eventually walked the course of 23,000 roads. Now, as one biographer has pointed out, her father was actually a cartographer, and she would have had easy access to all of the city maps in the various planning offices around London, so perhaps getting up at 5 a.m. and walking literally thousands of miles is a tiny bit apocryphal. But since the 1930s, the A to Z has helped steer millions of people around the city in, I think, incredibly personal and memorable ways. When I look at my own copies, and I stress copies because inevitably they would fall apart, they have scribbles all over the pages, pages ripped out, old underground tickets stuck in. And I remember when I lived in London, you would put into your back pocket your little miniature version of the A to Z. Initially, she actually found it incredibly difficult to sell the first copy. But this is, as I'm sure many of us can remember, what the A to Zs eventually looked like. In many respects, it has become an absolute design classic. It's almost sort of brutalist in its simplicity. And the fact was that what mattered were the roads, and nothing else to all intents and purposes. And although the first A to Zs were in black and white, very quickly they were published in color. And what you have are the A roads being shown in orange and the B roads in yellow. And consequently, London cabbies refer to them as the oranges and the lemons. And it has become a true design classic because it renders something extraordinarily complex, almost unwieldy to our imagination if you try to think of every road, every little nook and cranny that is actually drawn on the maps in an incredibly simple manner with tremendous clarity. If you ever got your hands on the very first edition and you were looking at an area actually just up this way and you were looking at Trafalgar Square, you would actually see one of the few errors in the first maps, and that was that Phyllis forgot to actually mention Trafalgar Square. And again, this is not necessarily apocryphal because apparently she knocked a shoebox full of filing cards out of her office window marked T. And she didn't rescue all of them, and hence Trafalgar Square was somewhat lost in the first edition. Now, there's somebody else that we all have an enormous amount to thank. And it's this man, Harry Beck. And I think you can all guess, if you look at what's behind him, what Harry Beck actually invented. What Beck did in an incredibly genius-like way was take this, which, as you can imagine, if we actually had retained an underground map that attempted to give you a sense of actually where the underground lines went, and you laid it on top of the actual surface map, would have become unbelievably confusing, to say the least. He took this and created this, which has become truly, arguably, one of the design classics of all time. Now, when you look at this and you realize that Harry Beck was an underground electrical draftsman, it starts to make sense. Because rather than thinking about an underground map in terms of its geography and in terms of its distance, instead of attempting to give a realistic sense of where the underground stations actually related to each other and actually physically on the map, what he did was he stripped the sprawling tube network down to its absolute essentials, to a neat diagram of colored, criss-crossing lines. The original dates to 1933. And what he did was he replaced all of the sinuous curves with straight lines, with horizontals, with verticals, with 45-degree angles, and completely skewed the scale, placing the stations at equal distances from one another and removing any notion of the map from above the ground. The result is almost a circuit board-like design, sparse in its initial versions, a little bit more complex nowadays, with it extending all the way to Heathrow on this side, and ever newer lines adopted. But one of the great things, and I think you can't actually read this, but it's actually, I believe, down there. Now all of the London Tube maps recognize Harry Beck as its original designer. And a little bit like Phyllis, he also had a few problems convincing the authorities that this was a great idea. But as soon as it was adopted in London, this particular design was adopted all over the world. The next city, curiously, to adopt it only a year or two later was actually Sydney in Australia. Now, this is perhaps one of the more unusual maps you're ever going to see of London, and I couldn't help but pop it in. It's actually a somewhat new phenomenon in which you use the Google results to create maps of cities or whatever you want, quite frankly. And so what actually this is doing is if you type Camden smells, or if you typed Covent Garden smells or Shoreditch smells into Google, You then take the top result, and hey presto, you have probably one of the more curious maps that you're ever going to see of London today. Now, some of these things do actually make a little sense. Heathrow, yes, smells of kerosene for some obvious reasons. But how, for example, does Highgate smell of the ocean, or Notting Hill smell like fashion? Perhaps my favorite would be Enfield smells like bacon. There's nothing better than a good old British bacon buddy. But the smell reminds us, obviously, that we can think of London on so many levels, and olfactory is clearly one of them. And apparently, the very air of Dalston summons images of hipsters. And perhaps Covent Garden smelling like a condom, that may be back to its history of one of the red light districts in London. But a little bit more seriously, this is a map that really does underscore what I talked about right at the beginning, that London is truly one of the most diverse cities on the planet. It is a melting pot that I don't think any other city can boast. There are some quite remarkable facts and figures. This is a map that underscores the largest foreign-born populations in London by each borough, with India, as you can see, being the dominant nationality of foreign-born populations. But if I were to ask you where France's sixth biggest city was in the world, I suspect most of you wouldn't think London, but it is. London actually has more French citizens living in it than Bordeaux or Strasbourg. Of its 8.6 million inhabitants, nearly 1 in 3 was originally born abroad. And by 2031, the immigrant population within the city will have overtaken British-born residents. Nigerians, Poles, Bangladeshis rank almost up with among Indians. And it does result in an extraordinary diversity throughout the city. But London has also always had this incredible magnetic pull to it within the United Kingdom itself. Growing up in the north of England, there was always the so-called and perceived north-south divide within the country. But it's easy to forget that in, for example, Italy, Rome is the center and seat of politics. Milan is the capital of fashion. In our own country, Washington is the seat of politics, New York, the financial heart, LA, the center of the film industry. In Germany, Frankfurt is the financial capital. But in Britain, so much of that is centered in London. It is the political capital, it's the financial capital, it's the financial capital. And so it has had, for many, many years, this magnetic pull that few capital cities across the world can boast. It is something that is encapsulated quite beautifully by the brilliant British author Zadie Smith in one of her more recent books called NW, or if we think of it as she did, as one of London's postal codes, Northwest. And it's the postal codes that really do resonate with meaning. They're the equivalent of our zip codes. And so if you think, for example, of NW3 up here, for any Londoner, NW3 stands for Hampstead, the Hampstead Heath. It's the haunt of the intellectuals, the media types, the doctors. Sigmund Freud died there. Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale there, and both of their houses are now museums. But if we thought about WC1 right here, it's Bloomsbury. It's the heart and soul of the universities in London, of the British Museum. and an astonishing array of those wonderful blue plaques that you see on buildings as you walk around the city, commemorating the famous people who lived there, including in WC1, Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens. And SW1, down here, became in the 1980s, somewhat infamously, the home of the so-called Sloane Ranger, epitomized by none other than Lady Diana Spencer, the ladies who would wear Wellington boots, Barber jackets, and Hermes scarves, populating the areas around Sloane Street and Knightsbridge. But the title of Zadie Smith's novel, NW, refers to NW6, or Kilburn. It's not an area of London that any of you will probably ever step foot in. It's adjacent to Hampstead and has historically been a solidly working-class Irish neighborhood, Irish immigrants flooding into England during the first part of the 20th century. It has become increasingly an incredible melting pot, indicative of London as a whole. But in many respects, as with so many other parts of London, London can be thought of as a series of villages, a series of towns that have come together. And so Kilburn can still boast extraordinary history. It's a town which stretches back to the 12th century. You went to take the waters in Kilburn. It was the site of a priory and the site of the Red Lion pub, no longer standing, but its foundation in 1444 still marked. And it is also actually the site of one of the great Art Deco buildings in London, the Gaumont State Cinema, a cinema with 4,000 seats. Now, although an Irish presence still remains in Kilburn, it is now small compared with the diversity of folks who live there. It's become a true multicultural district in every meaning of that word. Different mother tongues, different foods, different religions, different dresses, holding different cultural ambitions. They're all encapsulated in Zadie Smith's book. And I want to just read one paragraph from it because I think it does beautifully encapsulate the world that London has become, certainly outside of the center and what we'll be exploring in a few minutes as being the incredibly wealthy center now. Sweet stink of the hookah, couscous, kebab, exhaust fumes of a bus deadlock. Polish paper, Turkish paper, Arabic, Irish, French, Russian, Spanish, news of the world. Unlock your stolen phone, buy a battery pack, a lighter pack, a perfume pack, sunglasses, 3 for a $5, a life-size porcelain tiger, gold taps, TV cable, computer cable, audio-visual cables. I give you a good price. Leaflets, call abroad for less, learn English, eyebrow wax, Falun Gong. Have you accepted Jesus as your personal call plan? 101 ways to take cover. The complete black tent, the facial grid, back of the head, Louis Vuitton stamped, Gucci stamped, yellow lace, attached to sunglasses, hardly on at all, striped, candy pink, paired with tracksuits, skin-tight jeans, summer dresses, blouses, vests, gypsy skirts, flares, security lights, security gates, security walls, security trees, Tudor, modernist, post-war, pre-war, stone pineapples, stone lions, stone eagles. Faced east and dream of Regent's Park, of St. John's Wood, the Arabs, the Israelis, the Russians, the Americans. Here, united by the furnished penthouse, the private clinic. If we pay enough, if we squint, Kilburn need not exist. Free meals, English as a second language. Here is the Islamic centre of England opposite the Queen's Arms. And I think in Zadie Smith's words, you can feel both the exhilaration, the energy, the constant stimulation, a sense perhaps of an impermanence as well, a lack of roots, a communication that is in many languages, so many cultures brought together. And it is that incredible fullness that to me is so endearing. And I've been watching it now for between 3 and 4 decades. And at a remove, even though I did live in London for a couple of years, I think it becomes ever more clear every time you go back the incredible changes that London has undergone in recent years. I remember as a little kid some of the first memories of London being in London Zoo. What I didn't realize was the penguin pool is arguably one of the greatest modernist architectural gems anywhere in the world. It's actually grade 1 listed. The problem that London Zoo now has is because, of course, this is pretty small, as you can see, and they now have a very fancy new penguin pool called, I think, the Penguin Beach. But of course, because this is grade 1 listed, as I have to say are other buildings at London Zoo, including the Giraffe House, it cannot be touched. And so the challenge is that at feeding time for the penguins, apparently London Zoo constantly has visitors around the grade 1 listed original building designed by the modernist architect Berthold Lebutkin, waiting for the non-existent penguins, sad to say. Although this is an image of when it was still in use. What Lebutkin was absolutely fascinated by in the 1930s, this was built in 1934, was the use of the then new material of reinforced concrete and using it to create these beautiful spiraling ramps connecting the different levels, the sloping, cambered ramps enjoyed very much by the penguins for many, many years. For 2 years, I lived in London as a postgrad student, and it always was the greatest of pleasures to find those areas of London that remain, even today, still a little bit hidden, those areas that can be personal discoveries. And this is one of my absolute favorites. When I lived in London, you actually didn't go through what even now looks to be a relatively inauspicious hole in the wall. You actually ran a doorbell to a grey door in a wall, and the intercom would crackle, and finally the door would open into one of the most magical gardens anywhere in London, the Chelsea Physic Garden. Now, if you haven't been, you have to promise me you'll go. It was established as the Apothecary's Garden in England in 1673. It's the second oldest botanical garden in the UK after Oxford's Botanical Garden, and it is still very much a living, breathing, working botanical garden in the heart of London, in Chelsea, by the banks of the River Thames. It is in a slight dip, which means it has its own little microclimate. And the result is that not only does it have 5,000 edible, useful, medicinal, and historical plants, but it also has the northernmost grapefruit tree, and it also has the largest outdoor fruiting olive tree, all in London. From pomegranates to mulberries, from eucalyptus to ginkgos, they are all grown, including over 100 different types of tree. And if the gardens are not enough to entice you, the chocolate cake at the cafe should be. And there is nothing more wonderful than being able to sit under the awnings or just on the lawns in the heart of Chelsea. And as I said, this is truly a working garden. They've actually just undergone a number of new renovations recently and additions, with the new Garden of World Medicine just recently opening, which is Britain's first garden of ethnobotany, the study of the botany of different ethnic groups and indigenous people laid out within its walls. Now, when I lived in the city, it was a self-imposed challenge to come across as few tourists as possible on my walks around. And I was not a great traveler on the London Underground, and it meant that I would always try to get from A to B using the quirky little hidden passages that sometimes look more than a little inauspicious, particularly at night. And one of those areas is Neal's Yard, which until the not too distant past was used as part of the Covent Garden fruit and vegetable market. It's pretty much a storage area. It was completely run down, and as you can see today, is truly a magical and colorful area. But the most important thing to add to your list of foodie tips in London is just around the corner from Neal's Yard Dairy. And for any of you who spend more than your fair share of disposable income at Formaggio's on cheese, you've probably heard of Neal's Yard Dairy, which is one of the great English cheese shops, period, in the world. It's the only cheese shop you're ever going to go into, and if you ask for Stilton, you will be invited to choose from one of two truckles. The truckle which is ripe to eat that day, and the truckle for 2 or 3 days hence. And it's an extraordinary place, don't miss it. But what I loved was diving down little alleyways like this one, Lazenby Court. What I'm showing you here are all within literally 5 to 10 minutes of Covent Garden or Trafalgar Square. And these are these little fabulous hidden away passages that are still as active and as used today, really are instrumental in creating that sense of London as we have it all. It's a city that does embrace its past in extraordinary ways. And you dive down Lazenby Court, and as you can see, it's basically wide enough for one person. It actually gets so low at this point, you have to dip your head, and you dive down here. You come out here, and of course, there's a pub, the Lamb and Flag, right there. And Lazenby Court actually dates back to 1688. And the Lamb and Flag is actually on the site of a brewery that dates back to 1616. And as you can imagine, in the summer, this area gets just a little crowded, but you dive down Lazenby Court, and you turn the corner, and you'd see another little alleyway right here. And this is the entrance into true Harry Potter's London. In fact, so much so that unfortunately this is now on all too many Harry Potter tours of London. And it's called Goodwin's Court. It was built in 1627. And walking through this, you are literally taken back to Georgian times. It is one of the finest preserved sets of facades dating back to the early 1600s anywhere in London, with the highly polished knockers and knobs and the brass plates and the beautiful bowed windows. The gas lamps are still working, and the Georgian bowed windows would have at one time revealed an existence as a row of shops. It's truly a magical little place, and you can give anyone a fright as you pop out at the other end onto the street, and literally across the road is bibliophile heaven, Cecil Court, with over 20 antiquarian bookstores. Cecil Court was originally laid out in the 1670s. It's the first address in London of a certain W.A. Mozart and family at the age of 8 when he composed his first symphony, and at a time when Mozart was performing for King George III and Queen Charlotte. Residents of the apartments up above the bookstores have included over the years T.S. Eliot and John Gielgud. Now, unfortunately, not all of its past residents were quite as salubrious. In 1735, Elizabeth Calloway, who was the keeper of the so-called brandy shop in Cecil Court, apparently over-insured her goods and set the place alight. And she was found smoking her pipe a few streets away while Cecil Court and a few other adjacent alleys began to burn. The only person to have died in the fire itself was the mother of the painter William Hogarth. But still today, it is a magical place for finding the most wonderful books and pamphlets from all around the world. And if you pop out at this end, just around the corner is the National Gallery. And if you were to continue walking down onto Piccadilly, you'd get to the Royal Academy. And what I'm showing you is an image of the Sackler Wing, which was one of Norman Foster's relatively early editions in London. The Royal Academy, as you all know, has an incredibly esteemed history. And at the same time, it has what is, for me, one of the greatest works of art in London, and horrifyingly, one of the least well-known works of art in London. It is the work of art I will drag anyone to go see and try to visit every time I'm in the city, sitting on this bench and looking at Michelangelo's Tadi Tondo, which is the greatest Michelangelo sculpture in Britain. In fact, it's the only marble sculpture by Michelangelo in the country. And it is one of the most incredibly beautiful and poignant and moving works of art that you can imagine. And because no one knows about it, you usually can commune with it one-on-one. Made by Michelangelo in the very early years of the 1500s, it's one of 3 circular compositions, and like several other unfinished sculptural works, has been the focus of much scholarly debate. At the left, St. John the Baptist holding in his hands a goldfinch, representing the Passion, to the infant Christ who, as you can see, is recoiling away towards his mother, symbolically anticipating his future destiny. Don't miss it if you do find yourself at the Royal Academy. And London today is still thankfully filled with some of the most wonderfully quirky and special stores that you can imagine. One of which used to be a little bit of a childhood haunt because I loved paper from a kid. And in fact, when I went into academia and museum world, my initial love was actually drawing. So that love of paper has remained with me all the while. And one of the most special places in London for paper is the Royal Stationers, Frank Smyson, which was founded in 1887. It's one of only a handful of stores in the country that hold all 3 of the royal warrants, the warrants that are given for services rendered to the Queen, to the Duke of Edinburgh, and to Prince Charles. The history of the royal warrant actually being traced back to medieval times when competition for royal favor was intense, and the Lord Chamberlain would bestow in the 15th century the royal warrant on certain tradespeople. Smythson invented something that until recently we all used, sadly less so nowadays, which was the lightweight portable diary. And he did so by actually inventing a type of paper which is very lightweight. It's called featherweight, which is blue. And he managed to gauge it in such a way that, of course, the fountain pens, which were used at that time, would not bleed through it, but at the same time was light enough that you could create beautiful bound books that would actually be portable. I have a funny story about Smythson, and I hasten to add, today it's now a place where you can buy beautiful leather goods as well as your stationery. In the days when I first discovered it, it literally was where you would buy paper, pens, and very little else. But I have a funny story that a college friend of mine who was actually training to go into the church at that time, a student walked into Smythson on Bond Street and asked as to whether he could buy a pencil. He was in desperate need of something to write with. And at that point in time, the sales associates would actually wear morning coat, morning suit. And the gentleman he spoke to looked at Kelvin, and he took out of his top pocket a pencil and simply said, "Gratis." Enough said. Here is actually the workshops of Smythson, and you can see here they still engrave by hand your address onto so much of the stationery. Many of us, I'm sure, know Hatchard's, the booksellers on Piccadilly, the oldest bookstore in London, established in 1797 by John Hatchard, and has since Georgian times occupied the same premises. And, of course, James Smith, founded in 1830, and where else but London would you find Europe's oldest umbrella store? Its current site on New Oxford Street, with one of the finest preserved Victorian facades anywhere in the country. It's absolutely extraordinary on the outside, and even more so on the inside. There is one portrait in James Smith, and it is of this gentleman, James Hanway, who in the 18th century made it fashionable for a gentleman to carry an umbrella. And over time, what was considered a curious accessory was to gain increasing acceptance. The portable roof at that time having been used really only to shade you from sun, and usually through ladies. Of course, let's not forget that the actual root of the word umbrella is the Latin word umbra, meaning shadow, and umbrella meaning little shadow. So we have the home of the umbrella, and of course, London has such distinctive sights, and sights such as the red telephone box or the Routemaster bus, which have become truly iconic and revered as masterpieces of British design. A design that became regarded in the eyes of health and safety as a little bit too dangerous in terms of having the open back where you could literally hop on and hop off at somewhat will. Today, there's a fleet of nearly 9,000 buses serving almost 200, serving almost 20,000 bus stops across the city, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, the Routemaster bus was originally designed in 1954. In 2005, it was removed from service because of the concerns of health and safety, apart from one special heritage route. And it was replaced, to the chagrin of all Londoners, by a fleet of incredibly bland, bendy buses, which had a propensity of getting stuck around the tight corners of London streets. Only in London could the red bus then become a major source of political debate during the mayoral election, when Boris Johnson used the red Routemaster bus as a political ticket to victory in 2008, pledging to reinstate the buses. And the result is one of the sexiest and most beautiful returns to former glory that you can imagine. There was actually a full competition to redesign the Routemaster bus for the 21st century, and the designer Thomas Heverick came up with this incredibly beautiful, sinuous quality. This is the staircase, which goes up. It's an electrical hybrid double-decker, capturing in so many respects the dignity and the formality and the sense of wonder of the old Routemaster buses, with the glass coming around the back, and still with the opportunity to escape from the back, but now with a set of glass electric doors. And in a sense, it encapsulates what London has done so well in recent years. It's taken its heritage and it has reinvented it in very special ways. Now, you can, if you so wish, still eat in London's oldest restaurant, Rules. This opened in 1798. Velvet upholstered, wood paneled. It's a fantasy of a past that we can all experience still today. Charles Dickens, Thackeray, H.G. Wells all sat at its tables. It's appeared in numerous books by Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Dick Francis, and Jean le Carré. It even has a 1935 Rolls-Royce called Bubbles parked outside. But again, this encapsulates a shift which has occurred in London over the last 10 years. A shift that the great Parisian restaurateur Alain Ducasse himself declared, which is that London is now one of the most, if not the most important city and most exciting city to eat in. It's a city where you can now eat at Michelin-starred Indian restaurants and Michelin-starred Peruvian restaurants, where you can still eat at a place like Rules and yet know around the corner you have the very latest experimentation in gastronomy happening right on your doorstep. But it's also a city that in very recent years has begun to change quite considerably, and with a degree of, shall we say, vulgarity that is striking in its obviousness. Welcome to the world of London today, when sports cars are flown from Saudi Arabia, from Dubai to London, following their owners. These are three. There is actually a fourth, which is not in this photograph, and owned by the Saudi Arabian Prince Turki bin Abdullah, that made an appearance and also garnered lots of parking tickets earlier this spring. And it has now become a little bit of a hobby for the mega-rich youth of the Middle East when they move to London to escape the summer heat, to also bring their cars with them, to such an extent that the boroughs of Knightsbridge and Kensington actually had to put in place new local legislation to combat the racing of these cars around the streets of London. I actually experienced this myself when we were walking down Knightsbridge a couple of years ago, and the sequence of traffic lights down Knightsbridge was such that all of a sudden the road had pretty much emptied out. And all of a sudden we heard this roar from behind us, and this Lamborghini with Dubai license plates literally cannonballed its way down the center of Knightsbridge to the next red light. What the two drivers did not realize, and I bet you they were hardly more than teenagers, was that there was a policeman just slightly further along the street, and he simply stepped into the road and went like this. And my mom, as mums tend to do, sent me cuttings from the local newspapers, and sure enough, it made the front headlines of this Lamborghini being put onto the back of a tow truck and these two youngsters being hauled off. But it has actually become a business unto itself. Qatar Airways actually has a special dedicated plane now to ship these cars into London from the Arabian Peninsula. It's a reflection also of how London has historically always been a refuge, a center for the wealthy on a scale that none of us can even begin to imagine. In the 1960s and 70s, for example, it attracted a very large Greek population due to the constitutional crisis of the Greek monarchy. During the oil crisis of the 1970s, it became a refuge for many from the Middle East. And today, over the last 10 years, it has seen an extraordinary influx of the wealthy from the old Russia and Chinese populations. What we are looking at is a view down Knightsbridge, and this building to our right is a building called One Hyde Park. Its developers, the fittingly called Candy and Candy, insisted it was the world's most exclusive building anywhere on the planet when it opened in 2007. The most expensive apartment sold for nearly $250 million. It was designed by Richard Rogers with all of the special effects that you would care to have, from bulletproof glass to an X-ray machine to check all of your mail coming into the building. As a professor of architecture from Cambridge noted, it's a vulgar symbol of the hegemony of excessive wealth, an oversized gated community for people with more money than sense, arrogantly plonked down in the heart of London. But it does raise some truly serious questions. There was actually even, I think, on NPR last week, I can't remember whether it was in the morning or around Saturday lunchtime, a piece about the way in which money has been parked in London, largely through properties, how real estate agents in London have now got implicated in a lot of this black market money. And I would say this building encapsulates it, because if you walk past this building at night, there is hardly a light on. Almost all of the apartments were sold to overseas corporations, registered in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Liechtenstein. And the most troubling issue with this building and many other properties in London, currently only about 17 to 18% of property in London is sold to UK nationals. The really troubling issue is because of British tax laws, there are enormous tax loopholes that can be used in such a way that a lot of property taxes are not paid. And the result is that London is actually going to face, in future years, a genuine crisis of tax resources. that will be able to support the hospitals and the schools and the fundamental building blocks of what a city has to be. What you will also see as you walk around the streets of London are curious contraptions like this. One of the challenges for London is that its building stock, and I shouldn't say challenge, one of its beauties of London is that its building stock is mostly Georgian and Victorian. It's inflexible, much of it is listed. The result, if you can't go sideways and you can't go up, you go down. And in the middle of the 1990s, you began to see throughout London the beginnings of the so-called mega basements. Started small and began to get large, to the point where, again, many of the boroughs have had to impose special rules and regulations. One of the more extraordinary of the examples is taking place, or about to take place, under this house here. It is truly what has become known as an iceberg house. It is one of the great glories of the Nash terraces around Regent's Park. It was bought a few years ago for $40 million, pretty sizable, as you can see, but the owner has put in a planning application for a sub-basement that would be 150 feet long, double height, and include, as you can see, literally, almost 5 stories down. It would be one of the largest mega basements in London, and this is its owner, Damien Hirst. And what you're actually seeing is a gallery space that he is proposing to create underneath his new house, along actually with a very nice swimming pool too. But as you can see, this is actually a fully equipped art elevator that would be at the back of the house too. Extraordinarily, it has actually been approved at this point. There are petitions going on. But as you can imagine, the biggest challenges are with the destabilization of the foundations of all of the adjacent houses. And across London, there are significant problems occurring with subsidence due to the construction of these gigantic and enormous basement areas. Now, the city keeps growing. In the 1980s and 1990s, the Docklands and the East End of London, areas way over here, became the key, and I'm sorry that this is such a murky slide, became the key areas for development. The area right now that is growing at an exponential rate is this area right here. And just to situate yourselves, this is the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey, the London Eye. This is Tate Britain, and Vauxhall Bridge is there. It's an area of London called Nine Elms, and it got its name around 1645 from a row of elm trees bordering the road. By the mid-19th century, it had pretty much degenerated, and the area was described, and I quote, "a low, swampy district occasionally overflowed by the Thames," to give it a Dutch effect. And the area from that point on became a semi-industrial landscape. But it is now becoming a new embassy district. And part of it is because of the move of the American embassy out of Grosvenor Square. Now, the American connection to Grosvenor Square dates back to the late 18th century when John Adams was the first American envoy to the royal court. He lived only a few blocks away. And the Americans built, using the great architect Sarainen, an extremely fine and architecturally important and significant embassy in the very heart of London, with, of course, as you can imagine today, security headaches like there is no tomorrow. I can remember when I had to renew visas, student visas and work visas years ago, of literally just running into the embassy, throwing your passport at the guy behind the desk and popping out. Today, roads are closed around it. Barricades are placed in all of the immediate vicinity, and you can't even get close to the building without going through various security checks. And so it became very apparent to the Americans that they needed to move the embassy. It also has a rather fascinating and very quirky history to it. We all know that for any embassy in any country, it is supposedly on sovereign land. And a critical element of that is that the embassy is on land that is owned by its respective country. The challenge in London is that so much of central London is owned by the great estates. And for much of Mayfair and Belgravia, it's the great Grosvenor estate, owned by the Earl of Westminster, the wealthiest landowner in the UK. When the American government identified this site for their embassy, they, of course, assumed that the Duke of Westminster would sell the land to them. Acrimony ensued, and the Duke of Westminster said, "Sure, I will sell the land to you if you give me back the lands that I lost during the American Revolution." Now, as you can imagine, it was decided this wasn't going to be an equal exchange, given that it included most of Maine, most of New York, and I think parts of Florida as well. But, so this is actually the only embassy of the United States which is actually on a leasehold. It's a 999-year lease. They have sold it to the Qataris, and it has just been announced it will be converted into a hotel. And this is the new American embassy, which will be opening at the beginning of next year. It is very much under construction, and with new security features, a water feature, i.e. a moat, around the building. But what you're seeing is an enormous amount of new development which is also starting to occur. And yes, your eyes are not deceiving you. This is actually a glass swimming pool, which will actually bridge two buildings right here. And this is an area that, as I said, had been a completely industrial area with one great, true great architectural glory, Battersea Power Station, which remarkably survived because it had actually been decommissioned in 1983. But it is one of the great Art Deco glories of London. It's actually two power stations which were eventually joined together. And it's not only one of the largest brick buildings in the world, it's also notable for its lavish Art Deco interiors. Do you ever imagine that a power station is not going to have the care and attention that even the great hotels like Claridge's or the Savoy had in the 1930s? You're wrong. This was truly one of the finest examples of Art Deco, both out and inside, anywhere in the city. And this is what it looked like, and this is what it's going to become. $1 million apartments, The power station itself is being converted. You can see all of the roof gardens. The American embassy is here. This was literally, until very recently, completely derelict. And it really gives you a sense of how the city is continuing to grow, continuing to expand in remarkable ways. It's also happening in the City of London itself, with 3 buildings that have been given the fabulous nicknames of the walkie-talkie, the cheese grater, and the gherkin. Now, the gherkin has been described as a pretty fine pickle by many an architectural journalist, and has actually become one of London's most beloved new skyscrapers, arguably one of the few great skyscrapers in the city. The challenges of building anew in the City of London are immense, between the listed buildings and something else that we'll actually talk about in just 1 minute. But even though this is of such a radical shape, it has become greatly loved. It has none of the banal ugliness of the building behind it, the NatWest Tower. Its entire body curves. It is voluptuous. It glitters. It has these fabulous triangular panels that just reflect and fracture the light in beautiful and wonderful patterns of color and shade over the course of the day. And it's also pretty bloody brilliant in terms of its design. Norman Foster and Partners were the architects, but it actually has as its inspiration this what's called a diagrid skin from what's called the Venus flower basket sponge, a sponge from the ocean's bottom, and using that botanical structure, Foster and Partners created this absolutely magnificent structure. It's a building which has won an enormous amount of awards and praise, which is more than can be said for this beauty, the so-called walkie-talkie. Now, unfortunately, this is a building that has received some fair share of criticism and some fair share of newer nicknames, including the Fry Scraper and the Death Ray. Now, this was designed by Raphael Vignoli, and quite frankly, it has been a catalogue of disasters. It looms very awkwardly over its neighbours, getting fatter and more bloated as you go up to the top. And as one employee of the Royal Institute of Town Planners declared, and their offices are literally just around the corner from the building, it's a daily reminder never to let such a planning disaster ever happen again. So why has it become known as the Fry Scraper, or the Death Ray, or what became now the Walkie-Scorchy? Well, it has a pretty fundamental design flaw. Unfortunately, the rather wonderfully termed phrase, value engineering, resulted in a veil that was supposed to go in front of the building being value engineered out of the building while it was actually being built. And the problem was that at certain times of the day, it acted, the facade, without that veil, which it now has, caused a ray of light onto a neighboring street of such intensity it actually melted cars. And I kid you not, there are these great photographs of a Jaguar, but its body panels are completely askew. It cracked the sidewalk, and here it fried an egg. One architectural critic called it a fuggish comedy villain of a building. And after they sorted out the issue with the death ray, it then was realized that instead of burning people and things, it actually started blowing them away because of the downdrafts, strong enough to actually cause you to be knocked over. It was recently bestowed with the Carbuncle Cup by Building Design magazine for the worst building of the year. A building which has literally just opened, known as the Cheese Grater. And actually, I have to say that there is one architectural critic who has just declared, given there are a number of other buildings in the planning works, all of which also look like either kitchen utensils or what you'd find on your dinner table, that the City of London is fast becoming what you would actually expect to see at dinner time. This is a building designed by Richard Rogers and Partners. And if you think of Richard Rogers' other buildings, the Pompidou Centre, the Lloyd building, the Lloyd Insurance building in London, where the innards, the guts of the building are actually on the outside, this is an exceedingly refined and very beautiful version of that. And one of the reasons that it tapers at this 10-degree angle, hence getting the nomenclature of cheese grater, and reflective again of the challenges of building within the City of London, is this, St. Paul's Cathedral. And St. Paul's, along with Westminster Abbey and the Palace of Westminster, have certain protections in terms of sight lines from across various parts of London. And the sight line up Fleet Street to St. Paul's is preserved. Nothing can actually impact that view. And hence the building tapers rather dramatically away. It is also a building that you can see just down here and more detailed here that has a rather extraordinary connection to the sidewalk, including beautiful gardens and a rather fabulous structure underneath. And along with nicknames, so is the Shard. Renzo Piano's great skyscraper on the south side of London, a building that was inspired, according to Piano, by all of London's church spires, in Canaletto's paintings, and the masts of the sailing ships that would have gone along the Thames. The problem was that English Heritage described it as a shard of glass through the heart of historic London, and of course the nomenclature of the Shard stayed. It also, when it opened, had a little design boo-boo. Magnificent views, but what you can't really see from this is an extraordinarily complex facade in which the panes of glass are actually at numerous angles to each other. Part of the building, the lower part, is actually a hotel, the Shangri-La Hotel. And what guests realized very quickly at night when they turned their lights on was that the various patterning of the windows, so around this corner there might be a window that would actually jut out, resulted in a mirror effect. And so if you actually went up to your window, you would actually see somebody else's bedroom or bathroom, in some instances, reflected from the floors below or the floors above. So, as you can imagine, that hit the front headlines of almost all the newspapers. Very quickly, some more quirky but absolutely wonderful architectural sites of London today. One of the most interesting being this building, which was actually a parking garage until relatively recently. It's now a hotel, the Beaumont Hotel. And if you have very keen eyes, on the left, you see something a little wacky just there. And it's actually a sculpture, a livable, inhabitable sculpture by Anthony Gormley. And it's called Room. And yes, it is actually a hotel room that you can sleep in. It has literally just the bed, this beautiful wood paneling, and the bathroom, and that's it. Some of the most extraordinary architecture that has happened in London in recent years is thanks to the Serpentine Gallery and to a truly genius concept, which has been a series of commissions over the course of the summer to create a temporary pavilion adjacent to the Serpentine Gallery in Kensington Palace Gardens. The brilliance behind this is that there really is no hard and set fast definition of what a pavilion should be, what it should look like, what it should contain, and it obviously allows fantastic experimentation. This is one of my favorites, Sue Fujimoto's cloud-like pavilion, comprising of a grid of white poles that literally just ascend upward. It was made in this lattice-like pattern, a shimmering matrix. He called it a transparent terrain. And you can see how you could inhabit both the interior and quite literally the exterior as well. Beautiful at night, almost mist-like in its quality. One of the more extraordinary of the pavilions, however, was Rem Koolhaas's pavilion from 2006. Here, lit at night, this is the Serpentine here. This is it during the day, and yes, it is an inflatable structure. The canopy would be raised into the air to cover the auditorium and a meeting place, but it had this magical effect of just floating above the canopy of the trees and above the Serpentine in just a fabulous way. In terms of art today in London, we have this guy to thank, Nicholas Sirota, the director of Tate, director of both Tate Modern and Tate Britain, a pivotal figure in the rise of contemporary art in London, and a key figure in transforming this empty hulk of a building, the Bankside Power Station, built by Giles Gilbert Scott, who was also the designer behind the red telephone box, as a power station for London, largely inaccessible and empty, from the 1980s. And what it was realized was that this incredible space inside had enormous potential for this, Tate Modern. It's now one of the most visited museums anywhere in the world. It has had nearly 6 million visitors in some years. And it has served as a focal point for the regeneration. And the architects Herzog and de Meuron took this and created this. And their genius was recognizing the potential of just an extraordinary wow factor within this building. Now, many of you know, this guy from upstairs, our Anish Kapoor sculpture, Untitled Shoe Red. It's a little cousin compared to this, a 150-foot-long Anish Kapoor called Marsyas. Truly a feat of absolutely extraordinary engineering and construction. And it's an exemplar of the various commissions that have occurred within the space of Tate Modern. But my absolute favorite, and I think the favorite of many, was the Weather Project in 2003 by the Danish-Icelandic artist Olafur Eliasson. A diffuse golden sunrise from 200 yellow sodium lights and their reflection from above caused by a mirrored ceiling. One of the most incredible things about this project was how it affected people. And you can see here folks just lying on the floor, gazing upwards, staring, coming together as groups. And it was a spectacle that I will certainly never forget, and I think anybody who saw it would not either. And yes, the Tate is still growing. The newest building about to open literally in 10 days, the Herzog and de Meuron extension to Tate Modern, which will provide new spaces for education and additional gallery spaces for performance. The Tate has obviously also not been without controversy with the Turner Prize. The art critic Brian Sewell describing it as, "The prize descends to the level of an intellectual freak show in a circus and drags with it all of the arts of Western civilization." And who would have known that the Turner Prize would be broadcast live on television, that there's fervent discussion of all of its nominees, even in the tabloids, and that the bookies would actually take bets on the finalists. And of course, who would believe the annual protests? The Stuckists, founded in 1999, in various ways. The King of Crap. And of course, it wouldn't be Britain without a streaker. I want to finish with one of the most exciting public art projects anywhere in the world, and a project that has, again, had fantastic impact on today's London. It is, again, something which encapsulates this notion of London, past, present, and future. You can't pull the three apart when you're there or think about it. And it's the so-called Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square. It is the plinth that was supposed to have an equestrian statue on it. They ran out of funds. For 150 years, it stood empty, and is now the site of a rolling program of sculptures. This being Katharina Fritzsch's evocatively called Hahn Cock, gleefully feminist, pokes fun, of course, at all of the vainglorious sculptures of Nelson and George IV, the generals around this most sort of imperial of public spaces. And as Katharina Fritsch said, humor is always a big thing. You can't be too severe. Here is Ship in a Bottle by the artist Yinka Shonibari. It's a perfect replica of Nelson's HMS Victory, fully rigged. But you can just see that the sails are actually made of traditional African cloths. And in his words, the African textile patterns refer, and I quote, to the legacy of British colonialism and its expansion in trade and empire made possible for the freedom of ideas and new trade routes that Nelson's Victory provided. One of my favorites, though, was Anthony Gormley's One Another. It was a very simple conceit. Over the course of 100 consecutive days, 24 hours a day, a member of the public would be allowed to ascend to the top of the pedestal an hour at a time and do whatever they wanted. You can only imagine, as you can see here. It obviously became this fantastic metaphor, a fantastic symbol within the context of all that Trafalgar Square stands for. My favorite is this particular guy. I am not a pigeon. And this one, but is it art? And I'm going to leave you with one last image, which is actually the next Fourth Plinth. It's by an artist I love dearly. He's a Glaswegian artist called David Shrigley. He has one of the wryest senses of humor that you can possibly imagine, and his sculpture is evocatively called Really Good. Thank you. Okay, I know it's 12 o'clock, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer one or two. If you
I think
need
we
to
do have
run.
time for 2 questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you. Those of you that are leaving now, please do so quietly so we can get on with the Q&A. We'll start with back here. And Lauren, could you? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Edward. This has been amazing. I hope you'll repeat it sometime. My question is, how likely do you think it is that the tax law and the zoning law will change to correct the Damien Hirst disaster and the One Hyde Park or whatever it is?
It's a great question, and it's an incredibly prescient one, and it is one which is at the forefront of the media. As I said, it's even sort of getting into the media over here. It is clear that more and more boroughs within London are passing rules and regulations. It doesn't seem to be always working. The government recently passed legislation to try to combat some of the tax loopholes. They are incredibly complicated. We of course, are all hearing about Panama City, etc. right now. But there are realities that the City of London is perhaps one of the largest tax loopholes anywhere in the world in many respects. And if you think about a lot of the offshore centers that people park their money, whether it's the British Virgin Islands or wherever, they were oftentimes associated with the British Empire. And it is a very complicated, very tangled mess, and it is an increasingly critical one because this is something which I felt for the first time a couple of years back when I was in London last, that you literally can walk through large swathes of the city in the evening, and there are simply no lights on in the houses and in the apartments. And it is actually starting to have quite serious impacts on the local businesses, such as the restaurants. There was an article I just recently read the other day. Mayfair, which, as you know, has always been one of the wealthiest areas of London, has oftentimes had the moniker of a village. I mean, it still is a relatively small area of the City of London. But apparently more and more of the restaurants are actually closing because there is just simply not the local inhabitants to support that kind of business anymore. So it is now at the government level. There are investigations now starting quite deeply as to who owns many of these apartments. I'm sure many of you read the New York Times article, I think earlier this year or last year, about many of the big buildings going up in New York and the impossibility of figuring out who owns any of these apartments. So it is known as a critical problem because it is going to and is starting to affect funding for schools, for general refuge services, etc. So a huge issue right now. So.
I was wondering, given especially this current discussion, with global warming and the flooding of the Thames, all this building is going on, and yet, and the basements, what are people doing to really look at the reality of what's coming?
It's a great question, and in fact, the protests around Damien Hirst's basement are exactly that. What would happen if it flooded, and then the impact on the water tables adjacent. The Thames, as you all know, has the Thames Barrier quite a way down the river, which is intended as the main means to protect the City of London from flooding. I think it was 2 summers ago now, it was raised on more occasions than it has ever been raised in its history. And it is clear that it is not going to be able to support the level of protection that is going to be needed. And there are already conversations and plans as to what the next level of protection will be further down the estuary. It is clearly, again, an enormous issue. We are obviously in it right now at the MFA with our Megacities exhibition, thinking through many of the issues that are at the forefront of challenges that cities face today, whether it's transportation, whether it's issues of flooding, whether it is issue of housing. But in the context of London, the Thames is a tidal river. It does flood. It has been on the verge of flooding much more frequently. And again, it is clearly going to be a major challenge as we move forward. That being said, there are still plans that have been drawn up of, for example, moving Heathrow completely lock, stock, and barrel way down the Thames estuary, and so that it would literally be on an island. So there are still many plans moving forward, and obviously with this environmental threat in the background of many people's thinking and planning. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
okay.